Hello guys, Joker the Fool here, back at it again with my reviews of Saints and Sinners. I should just say the review of Saints and Sinners. This is, of course, the Cross to Bear cover. This is Jay David's short story, but there are 6 short stories in this first anthology from the Rippaverse, and this is a really strong showing from the Rippaverse, especially as a first effort for an anthology, and I really hope there are many more of these to come because this is a really fantastic collection. And while when this was announced in that really big event earlier this year, sometime around the spring, if I'm remembering correctly, the really exciting thing for me with this is the artists that work on this as well. So this book has a great amount of visual flair from story to story, and with Invisible Art Studio doing all of the lettering, it feels very consistent. So it's great to read through all of these stories, and everything feels like it's very much so part of the Rippaverse. But without further ado, we're going to get right into the story, and we're going to go with the first story. It's Az' short story, Chasing Ghosts, which is, of course, by Az versus Heels versus Babyface. And of course, you've got Diogenes Neves as the penciler, Eber Ferraria, if I'm saying that correctly, as the inker, and Andrew Kramer as the colorist. And this is a really interesting story about Ingrid Valdez basically doing investigations of these like supernatural demonic forces that are killing people. And then you've got, spoiler alert here, if you guys don't want to be spoiled, I'm going to go into spoilers now. You've got the appearance of Bloodroof in the story, basically saying that she's contending with magic, and that's where the story really heats up. Although there isn't really a very clear, satisfying conclusion where Ingrid brings the ghosts into custody. That's why it's chasing ghosts and not capturing ghosts, I suppose. But what is there is pretty satisfying, and this does give us a lot of great insight into the character of Ingrid, and a little bit of insight into the post-Alpha Core 1, or the events after the fallout of Alpha Core 1, which is also really nice as well. And then, of course, this art is laid out fantastically. Everything looks really good, and it does fit in quite well with the established style of the Rippaverse, as all these stories do. And like I said, Invisible Art Studios does all of the lettering for this book, and that one, they do great lettering in terms of the onomatopoeia, and of course in terms of just the regular word balloons, and everything fits in really well, not only with what comes before in the Rippaverse, but just in this book, it feels very nice to just go and read through each story on its own. But yeah, that is Chasing Ghosts. I do really like this one. Like I said, even if it's one that needs like more to really get all the ideas out, is definitely one that if there's like a part 2 of Chasing Ghosts, if it's its own like 56 to 96 pages of story, I would absolutely love that as well. But this is definitely something that's worth 100% exploring. I do like how Az handles the character of Ingrid, Bloodroof, and then of course the entire Rippaverse in general. I think he does a fantastic job, and all of the art is fantastic as well. But next, we're on to a Cross to Bear. This is Jay David. I believe he's also known as Junk 3PO. He's a writer for Achromatic Chronicles, which I reviewed. Fantastic work. You've got Chris Bolson as the artist, with Guilherme Lindenberg Mendez as the colorist, and of course, that letterer is the same. And Cross to Bear is certainly the, I want to say, most interesting story, but it's definitely the most pulp story in the Rippaverse. I mean, you look at this art and it's got this fantastic, rich pulp style, and it really works for the type of character that Cameron Cross is, but this is really more or less a teaser of his full story rather than a full-on contained short story. So it gives you just enough to get an insight into who Cameron Cross is, what he's about, and then it's really intriguing when we learn that there are cyborgs in the Rippaverse, and of course you've got an epic spread like that. So, and I do like the religious aspects as well. But like I said, there really isn't, this is how it ends, really isn't much of like, hey, we've got this really defined story set. That's not what Jay's going for. He's just going for introducing Cameron Cross and really just teasing the idea of what a full Cross to Bear story would be like, which I think is something you can do when you have a story that's part of an anthology. If this was something that was like standalone in the Rippazine, I would give it a little bit more flack for him doing that. But this certainly does work I would love to see more of Cameron Cross's story based on what I've seen here, and this art is absolutely fantastic. But this is definitely, I wouldn't say one of the weaker stories, but it certainly is one that doesn't have as much like narrative punch, because it's just introducing this character and basically just teasing his existence in the Rippaverse, rather than giving us like a really full-on like origin story or good beginning to his tale. But anyways, the next story up is The Weight of Restraint by Eric July, with Elias Martins as the interior artist and Diego Albuquerque as the colorist. This certainly is a really, again, it's got this nice pulp style, a lot of cross-hatching in this. And of course, these scenes are rather dull and drabby, but they still have a lot of rich color. Like you've got like the orange prison suits, you've got the blue prison uniforms, and everything's got great contrast and looks very nice. So the color work looks absolutely fantastic. And this is one that combines, Eric July's combining this idea of a corrupt Florida Park judicial system with the character Sanford Willard that we've seen in ISOM number ISOM, all the issues, basically all the issues of ISOM except maybe 3. I can't remember if he had a big appearance in 3, but definitely 1 and 2, a more prominent role in 2. But this definitely seems to be a younger Sanford Willard. So he was in prison, don't know why, but it does tease us that idea. It does give us some insight into the origin of Sanford, which is really interesting. And he's going to be a very interesting character going forward, especially if you've read ISOM number 2. So I'm certainly really interested in seeing where this idea goes, hopefully explored more in ISOM as we talk about Sanford, but I would certainly love to have Eric do a full-on Weight of Restraint story to really give us a good origin story of Sanford, and then that gets referenced in the ongoing series of ISOM. But I certainly do love everything about this story, and it has, again, a bit more of a tease of a narrative rather than a full-on narrative, which, like I said, is something you can do in these anthologies. And I think there's just enough here to really build some intrigue and be like, hey, I'd like to see this explored in ISOM. And that's really the feeling that I get. So next one, and I think this is the weakest story in the collection. It's Bone God, and it doesn't have anything to do with the art, as Will Conrad is the artist, and he does fantastic work on everything he's done for the Rippaverse, including this story. But Caleb Edwards does really have a lot going on in this story. I'd say a bit too much for the 15 or so pages in this story. So there's a lot of really interesting ideas here. And I do like the fact that this is a self-contained story. But there's just like, you can see all of this dialogue here. Of course, Will Conrad's art is absolutely fantastic, but there's just so much dialogue because there's so many different characters and they all have this history and they're having these interactions and such. That it's a bit hard to wrap your head around. It's easier to do so because there's a lot of tropes, like it's a very ambitious archaeologist with his ex-wife and 2 rich children, and that makes it very easy to understand. Of course, you've got character Maps, who's this like eclectic, like Harvard or something like a Harvard or Stafford, whatever, Ivy League school scholar being tagged along. So these characters are very easy to wrap your head around. So when there's so much interaction going on between them, it's easier to understand what they're doing and saying, but it's just a little bit too much for a 15-page or so. This was a meaty, full-length graphic novel. Then Caleb Edwards would be able to take all of this interaction and spread it out. The exposition, the character development definitely needs to have more room to breathe in the story. But what is here definitely leaves me wanting that, especially if you get Will Conrad to do like a full 96-pager. I would absolutely love to see that as well because his art is fantastic. It certainly is the strongest part of the story. And Caleb Edwards does have a lot of really interesting ideas that I want to see explored. But like I said, I just don't think he had enough in terms of page count to fit everything he wanted to as adequately as he would be able to if this was a longer story. So I think this is justified being a longer story, but it is a little bit of a mess because there's just so many characters and so much going on with this story. But I certainly am interested by what is here. But next up, we've got The Underdog, which I personally think is the best story in this collection without a doubt. And I would say it's because the Saska sisters wrote this story. This is, of course, a story about the SSWL. This serves as the origin story for Larry Shungai, who appears very, very briefly in item number 2. And this, of course, follows Big Tuna, which if you've read Horseman Welcome to Flores Park, you know what happens to Big Tuna. And I think he's a really interesting character, so it's really fun to see more of him. And you've got Cliff Richards doing the art on this, and you've got Marco Polandra doing the color work for this. They do fantastic artwork. And some of this does feel, like I said, some of the poses do feel a little bit like ripped out of item 2, especially this pose here. It reminds me of Santuan and such, but it definitely does work. I like the layouts that Cliff does, even if he's using like poses and stuff that he's used in item before. It all works. It definitely has its own unique flair. And of course, I certainly really love the way the Saskas wrote this story. This feels like a complete origin story for Larry Shungite. And not only is it an origin story for Larry Shungite, it also gives us great insight into the SSWL, how it functions. And it's just something that if you're a fan of wrestling, you're going to love this story. But if you just like the Rippaverse and you want to know more about the SSWL, this works fantastically as well. And like I said, the story focuses on Larry as the underdog, and he really just goes to town on Big Tuna, which is a really fun thing to see. It definitely is really satisfying to see Larry come up from the bottom and absolutely win. But also as well, it just has a very defined beginning, middle, and ending, and it's a very satisfying story. So when I did my review of Catch and Kill by the Saska sisters, I mentioned this feels longer than just a short story. And I had that same structure here, that same exact feeling. The Saskas are really good at writing these short stories with a short page count. So this is by far the best story in the collection. I would say a lot of it has to do with the fact that the Saskas know how to write these complete stories in these very short scripts. So hats off to them. And of course, Cliff does fantastic work in bringing that script to life. But that's really all I've got to say about Underdog. Next up is the last story, which is One Little Push by Will Jordan, who's also known as the Critical Drinker, I believe. And this story is a really interesting concept. It's called One Little Push, but it's a hitman being hired to assassinate Yaira by Darren Fontano, not because he has any personal beef against Yaira, but because he wants to make a statement, which I think is a very interesting idea. And I think the execution could have been a little bit better. You've got this character here who just kind of shows up and does things. It's not really explained, so there's this air of mystery about that. Could it be Dokuman? Could it be someone else? We don't know. But it has a pretty good structure in terms of, like, you've got this establishment, then he prepares, then he makes plans for the assassination, and of course, it doesn't work out. Yaira does survive, and you've got this fantastic art here. This is, of course, the art is done by, if I can go, by Carlos Reno, and Marco Lescos does the coloring, and there's a lot of, like, you know, this is like a sunset kind of scene here, so there's definitely a lot of fantastic color work in this story, and the art is rendered quite fantastically. Of course, all these character designs absolutely shine through, because this is working with a bunch of characters that are established in the Rippaverse. So we're talking about Darren Fontano, Yaira, Altona. Those are basically your three big characters that are in the story that have made appearances in other Rippaverse books. Excuse me. And I definitely love how they show up here. They all act like how you would expect them to act, and it makes the story feel much more grounded and interesting for fans of the Rippaverse. If you're just picking this up as your first Rippaverse book, you might not have the value if you're a longtime fan of the Rippaverse, because, like I said, it is a little bit confusing on how it ends. It's a bit of a head scratcher, but I certainly do like the ideas that are being worked with here. And as a fan of the Rippaverse, as a fan of these characters, I think this was an interesting story to read. But it's not, I would say, the absolute best story of Saints and Sinners. But regardless, I still think it was worth the read, and I 100% think that Saints and Sinners is worth the read. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this review, even with my post-it notes all in the way. But I do that so that way I can just flip to it and maintain some sort of structure when I do these anthologies. But regardless, this is a really, really strong showing for a first anthology from the Rippaverse. Hopefully they stick with doing more of these, because this is really good stuff. I definitely think a lot of these stories deserve to have their own full issues as well. But even if that doesn't happen, Saints and Sinners, I love the name of it. I love the talent that Eric July had around him, was able to gather around him to make this story. And of course, I just love how this was marketed. And of course, all the covers as well. It's a really cool thing. So this is 100% well worth the time and money to read if you're a fan of the Rippaverse. Certainly so. I wouldn't recommend this as your first foray into the Rippaverse. You're probably better off with Great War Separation or the first issue of whatever character or team of characters like Alpha Core would interest you. But if you like the Rippaverse even a bit tangentially, you've read some other stuff and you like it, I would recommend picking Saints and Sinners up because it is a fantastic experience. It's really well done, and it definitely lives up to the quality that the Rippaverse has established for themselves. But that is all I have for this review. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Joker is out.
Thank you for stopping by the Velvet Room. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you can keep up with Velvet Room Publishing. And go to velvetroompublishing.com if you want to go even deeper into the Velvet Room.